Ashes by J.C. Jarrett. Chapter 11. Tales at the Spigot. The next couple weeks rolled by quickly, and with nothing but patrols for the caravan guard to do. Before they knew it, they were back at the town of Oak Grove, having delivered the load of ore to the blacksmiths of Crimson Hollow. Captain Tarn pulled the guard around and began to pass out leather bags of jingling coin. "Thank you all for the excellent work. See you next season if you need more work." The released guards stood there for a moment, watching the caravan captain walk away. The trio of Jana, Rand, and Kudan looked at the rat face of Rubius, who said, "Let's head to the Rusty Spigot." The Rusty Spigot was a tavern and four-story inn nestled in a walled compound. It was a famous location between the capital city of Port Haven and Oak Grove. The walls had held off goblins and even a few giants. The inn has stood the test of time, being built over 100 years ago. Nearly every person that traveled the road would make a stop there. After a few days of easy travel, the west gate of the Rusty Spigot came into view. The path was hard-packed and well-worn, entering the thoroughfare. Dozens of people milled about the walled compound. Kudan was dumbfounded by the sheer mix of races and people. Standing by the blacksmith stand was even a pair of tinkers, their metal bodies sparkling in the sunlight. The inn itself was a beautiful building, made of old polished wood. It stood an impressive 4 stories, with the northeast corner being a round tower section full of windows and with balconies. They all looked about in excitement as they headed to the inn's front door. The tavern on the first floor of the inn was a bustle of commotion. There were large round tables and long tables with benches. The noise of the dozens of voices intermingled into a roar of sound. In the area of the tower section of the room, there was a large table full of food where customers could buy plates and fill them with all the food they could carry back to eat. Along the east wall was a huge bar with full shelves covering the wall of every type of wine or spirit in the realm. Along the west wall was a large stage where minstrels or bards could perform. Then, in the southwestern corner, was a staircase going up to the numerous private rooms. Kudan made his way through the crowd of people and tables straight for the food, while Jana, Rand, and Rubius sat together at an empty round table. "So, we stay here tonight then to where?" Rand said to the wizard. "To the north on the edge of the great ravine lays the Taline Monastery ruins," the rat-faced man responded. "The Taline Monastery?" came a voice from behind the trio, turning to see a tall, thin man with brightly colored clothing. His face carried an easy smile and a sparkle in his eyes. "If you want to know about the monastery, I can tell you all about it," he said in a rich, full voice. The man stood and moved with grace toward the stage, quickly mounting it. The crowd took notice of this. Conversations began to soften to a whisper, then there was near silence. "I am Connor. I have spent most of my life traveling and collecting the world's greatest stories," he said with a flourish. Swinging a lute from his back, he began to absently strum a slow melody. "But none compare to this tale of good versus evil, of artifacts and swords, of the living and the dead." He trailed his voice off, and with a wave of his hand, the lanterns around the room dimmed, creating a gloomy atmosphere. With that, he began his tale. "There are some actions that should not be forgotten, and some things that should be lost, that are." As he spoke, ghostly images began to appear to play out the tale as the bard spoke. Once not far from here was a wizard that as he studied, he began to experiment with the forbidden magic of necromancy. Starting small, he used animals and then moved to rob graves. So, he had several undead minions that moved all over his small, secluded tower. The magical image proceeded to show its story as the bard spoke. As the wizard neared the end of his life, he grew bitter and unwilling to accept the fate that everything must accept, that all things die. Several images of people dying flashed across the stage. The crowd was now silent and hung on Connor's every word. But he had a plan. He created a set of beautiful black robes that he wove threads of the thinnest Talayan silver. He spent a few years slowly casting enchantments upon the robes, till he felt he was ready. Now nearly 90 years old, the wizard could hardly lift his arms, but he was able to cast the final enchantment, and with its last word he fell lifeless to the floor. The image of the tower was still, but slowly dust gathered, and then walls began to crumble, till finally just a ruin survived. A millennium or more passed, and though the tower crumbled, the robes sat undisturbed upon a stone altar. "Now let's change the scene," the bard said with a wave of his hand, causing the image of the robes to change to a group of young men, all with shaven heads and simple tunics. These were the monks of the Talayan monastery, and every year the young monks would go on a pilgrimage. They would travel the land, providing aid and asking for nothing in return. They could carry no wealth of any kind, and were allowed no belongings beyond the clothes they wore and what they needed to survive. Most people who the monks helped would repay the kindness with food, lodging, and clothing. Several more images of the monks tilling fields and repairing wagons flashed across the stage. Fate would stir its fickle finger in the ongoings of the Budli monks. Late into winter, the monks happened upon a broken-down wagon in a small merchant caravan. Stopping not far from what we know now as Crimson Hollow, the monks helped repair the wagon's wheel and got the merchants back on the road. They traveled together for the rest of the day. Then the merchants repaid the monks with a large meal and a warm fire. The image showed a happy group eating and drinking around a fire at the edge of a wood. But not all was well. One monk, who we will call Desmond, was not used to such rich foods that the merchants had offered, and having gorged himself, he soon found he needed a private place to relieve himself. Desmond moved through the dark wood away from the camp and suddenly found himself at the edge of an ancient ruin. Connor looked out at the crowd. Every eye was upon him, caught up in his tale. The nighttime sounds had gone silent, and a strange feeling came over Desmond. Then he heard it for the first time. "Desmond," a voice called from the darkness. The monk jumped in fright, looking about for who called his name. Then again he heard the voice call his name, "Desmond." He looked about again to see a shaft of moonlight come down to rest on a robe folded neatly on the ruin's floor. There was no dirt or even dust on the robes. Heaps of fallen leaves lay all about, but none touched the robes. Desmond reached down and took the robes from the floor. They were so warm and soft, so different from the tunic he wore now. The image showed the monk retrieve the robes from the ground and look about sheepishly, stashing them in his pack. This, folks, is where our story takes a turn for the worse. Desmond went back to the camp and bedded down for the night, away from the others. Suddenly he awoke with a start. He was standing over one of the merchants, whose head was split open, blood and chunks of flesh was everywhere. Looking down, Desmond saw his hands were covered in blood, and in his right he held the axe used to chop the firewood. The real horror was not yet realized. As he looked about in shock, he saw that every person and animal was lying dead in a pool of blood, all killed with an axe. Desmond looked again at his hands covered in blood, then noticed he was wearing the black robes. The bard paused, looking at the audience. The same voice that called out in the ruin came back to Desmond's ears. The voice was clear and deep, its words compelling. "You are Desmond no more. From now on we are Mordenvex." These were the last words Desmond heard as himself, his mind fully taken over by the spirit that now called itself Mordenvex. Mordenvex began by raising the dead in the camp, and then soon had a small army. He took his dead and attacked the Talayan monastery, killing and raising the monks there. The evil necromancer took the monastery as his home, and set the undead about the place working as a guard. For years he sat and toiled, nobody knowing for sure what had happened to the monks. Till finally a Talayan paladin, named Dalis, was dispatched to investigate the missing monks. The vision showed an armored knight upon a horse, with a squire riding out of a castle. We all know that though he died in the process, Dalis was able to vanquish the evil, though some say that the evil still stirs there and is considered cursed. The image now showed the monastery as it is today, run down and unused. Maybe there is a spark of evil still there, and one day will rear its ugly head. He finished in a crescendo of sound, as a sudden burst of light, as the image expanded into an evil-looking face. Several people in the audience jumped in fright and let loose a yelp. Others laughed. Coins were tossed onto the stage and tipped to the bard, who removed his hat and held it upside down in his hand. The people watched in joy as the coins flew from the floor and midair into the hat and seemed to have disappeared, for not one fell out when he placed it back on his head. Rand, Jana, and Kudan all looked at Rubius with faces that said more than words ever could. "You must be joking," Jana said, beating Rand to speaking. "No, my dear, I surely am not," said the wizard with confidence in his voice. Rand looked at the barbarian, seeing the want for this payoff. Then he looked at Jana. He knew as soon as those eyes were upon him that he was in love with her. He would do anything to be with her, and if he had to go to this undead-infested monastery so that they could begin a new life together, he would. Jana held Rand's gaze. She felt her heart skip a beat. She so wanted to start a life with this man, and this gold could do that. She reached out across the table and took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. The pair looked at the barbarian. He smiled, knowing the answer before they spoke. "We will do it." The rest of the evening passed with much merrymaking. They drank mug after mug of foaming ale, and ate steaming plates of roast meat and potatoes. The bard even played a few turns, adding to the festiveness. Far sooner than expected, the tavern area began to clear as people made their way to rooms or homes nearby. Rand and Jana had found a dimly lit table in a corner. Together they sat talking hand in hand, eyes for each other only, as if the rest of the world was gone. "I think we should go to our rooms," Jana said, her voice sounding unsure of her own statement. "Sure," Rand said, never taking his eyes off the beauty. "Wait, what?" he said in sudden surprise, just now comprehending what she said, being so lost in the moment. It was very late. The lights of the tavern had been dimmed, and there were just a few very drunk, very unconscious people. The pair stood and started toward the stairs, Jana in the lead. Together they walked up the stairs to the second floor and partially down the hallway. Jana stopped suddenly at a door marked 208. "This is mine," she said, as she unlocked the door with the key. Rand stopped and turned to the beauty, the flickering lantern light reflecting in her ice-blue eyes. He could not believe how attracted to her he was, how it was not just physical, but a true connection, like they were meant to find one another. He could not contain his feelings any longer. With a sudden urgency, he stepped to her, taking her in his arms. He pulled her tight to him, and she allowed it, for she so desperately wanted his touch as much as he wanted hers. Their lips met in passion as the pair pressed against the door. Rand's fingers ran through her hair, then came to rest on the back of her neck. The kiss was long and breathtaking, with the number of feelings displayed in a single act. Jana did not want this to end, but knew they could not stay here, reaching back behind her. She turned the door's handle, allowing the door to swing open. Rand took this cue. Reaching down, he picked her up, cradling her in his arms. They disappeared into the room. With the heel of a boot, he closed the door.